Okay, down
See,
again.
the rain knew that you had to start it.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and get started. First of all, my name's Paul Donati. I'm a volunteer ambassador here at the Flight 93 National Memorial. So I want to welcome you to the memorial. Thank you for coming. Um, as you all know, on the morning of September 11th, 2001, terrorists hijacked 4 aircraft with the intention of flying them into 4 major targets within the United States. And again, as you all know, 3 of those 4 aircraft reached their targets. The 4th, United Airlines Flight 93, did not reach its target. And probably again, as you all know, the reason Flight 93 did not reach its target was because the passengers and crew of Flight 93 made the decision to fight back to try to regain control of the flight. So what I'd like to do this morning is give you some more information on 9/11 and more specifically Flight 93, things that you may not know. The story of Flight 93 is really one that the more you know, the more amazing it becomes. And the more you know, the more you will have deeper honor and respect and gratitude for what these 40 individuals on Flight 93 did, not just for us, not just for the country, but really for the whole world. But before I get into that, one of the ways that we honor the passengers and crew of Flight 93 here at the National Memorial is by telling their individual stories. So I'd just like to briefly tell you about 2 of the flight attendants that were on Flight 93. This is Lorraine Bay. She was 58 years old. She was in her 37th year as a flight attendant, and she ranked 4th in seniority among over 700 flight attendants at the Newark, New Jersey airport. Lorraine was known as the card lady because she sent cards to everyone and everybody for every reason. And as a matter of fact, 2 of her ill colleagues received cards from Lorraine after her death that were postmarked September 11th. So one of the last things that Lorraine Bay did before boarding Flight 93 that morning was an act of love and caring by sending 2 sick coworkers get well cards. Lorraine always carried her own corkscrew on every flight, just so she could more quickly and easily assist passengers who needed a corkscrew. That corkscrew was found out here in the wreckage of Flight 93 and eventually returned to her husband, Eric, who then donated it to be on display at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum up in New York. So if you get a chance to get up to New York to visit the museum, look for Lorraine Bay's corkscrew in the Flight 93 section. And this is C.C. Ross Lyles. For 6 years, C.C. Ross Lyles was a police officer and a detective in Fort Pierce, Florida. And she was very good at her job. She even recruited her future husband, Lorne, to the police force. C.C. and Lorne had sons from a previous marriage, and Lorne has said that their blended family was meant to be because all 5 sons were Jays: Jordan, Jerome, Javon, Justin, and Jarrell. But CeCe's dream job was always to become a flight attendant. So in the year 2000, she made the decision to switch careers. She was hired by United Airlines, started her flight attendant training, and completed it in January of 2001. CeCe made phone calls from Flight 93 the morning of 9/11, and she very calmly and professionally described what she was witnessing and the activities of the terrorists. So I think that calm, professional demeanor that she had can be attributed to the police officer and detective training that she had in Fort Pierce, Florida. And then finally, Lorne has said that having CeCe's remains here at the Flight 93 National Memorial is like having CeCe in the backyard of heaven. So now let me get into the information on 9/11 and then more specifically Flight 93. The terrorists chose 4 aircraft that were early morning, nonstop, East Coast to West Coast, so that they would be fully loaded with fuel for maximum damage. They chose 4 aircraft that were scheduled to take off within a small window of time. so that the 4 attacks could happen within a small window of time. So that after the first one, we would not have time to react to the second, third, and fourth. At 7:59 a.m., American 11 took off from Boston. American 11 was destined for Los Angeles. American 11 took off fairly close to on time, was hijacked fairly quickly after takeoff, turned around, pointed towards its target, which was the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 15 minutes later, United 175 took off. Also from Boston, also destined for Los Angeles, also took off fairly close to on time, and was also hijacked fairly quickly after takeoff, turned around, pointed towards its target, which was the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 6 minutes after United 175 took off, American 11 took off from Dulles Airport down by Washington, D.C. American 11, also destined for Los Angeles, also took off fairly close to on time, also hijacked fairly quickly after takeoff, turned around, pointed towards its target, which was the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. So 3 of the 4 aircraft took off fairly close to on time, hijacked fairly quickly after takeoff. Now Flight 93. Flight 93 was scheduled to depart Newark, New Jersey, destined for San Francisco. Has anybody ever flown out of Newark, New Jersey and flown on time?
Nope.
Yeah, Newark was, and I believe still is, known for flight delays. It is somewhat of a flaw, thankfully, in the terrorist plan that they chose a flight out of Newark, New Jersey. There were 2 very important delays with Flight 93. The first occurred in Newark. They were delayed taking off. Right off the bat, Flight 93 was behind that small window of time that the terrorists wanted. They did not take off until 8:42 a.m. Just 4 minutes later, at 8:46, American 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. So actually, some of the people on Flight 93 may have been some of the last people to see the Twin Towers prior to being attacked. Because when you take off from Newark, you can see Manhattan. So Flight 93 takes off at 8:42. 4 minutes later, at 8:46, American 11 strikes the North Tower. If you were watching the TV or listening to the radio or whatever that morning, and you heard about that, you probably thought it was some weird accident. You know, how in the world could that happen? It was clear blue sky all across the country that morning. They call it severe clear. You know, how in the world could that happen? Had to be some kind of weird accident. But 17 minutes later, at 9:03, and 9:03 is a very important time for the morning of September 11th, 2001. At 9:03 a.m., United 175 struck the South Tower of the World Trade Center. And when that happened, that's when we all knew. We all knew that first one was no weird accident. We all knew these were deliberate attacks. So 9:03 a.m. Then at 9:37 a.m., American 77 struck the Pentagon. So now I said there were 2 important delays with Flight 93. The first in Newark. I also said the other 3 planes were hijacked fairly quickly after takeoff. Not Flight 93. For whatever reason, and we'll probably never know why, hijackers on Flight 93 waited 46 very important minutes before they hijacked that plane. They waited from takeoff at 8:42 until 9:28. So now, by 9:28, not only is Flight 93 even further behind that small window of time that the terrorists wanted, but by 9:28, they were far from their target. In those 46 minutes, Flight 93 had time to fly from Newark, across New Jersey, all the way across Pennsylvania, and they were near the Pennsylvania-Ohio border when they were finally hijacked at 9:28. And then they flew even a little further west towards Cleveland before they finally turned the plane around, pointed it in a southeasterly direction towards Washington, D.C. So what I'd like to try to do now is kind of have you understand what the passengers and crew of Flight 93 may have been experiencing when they were hijacked at 9:28. You know, anytime you fly, you feel a little bit of mild turbulence. It can make you uneasy, maybe even a little afraid. Well, what the passengers and crew of Flight 93 experienced was far more than a little bit of mild turbulence. When they're hijacked at 9:28, Flight 93 immediately dropped 700 feet in altitude and began flying erratically. So just try to imagine. Within a few minutes, and this happened on all 4 planes that morning, within a few minutes, the terrorists forced all of the passengers and crew members who were still able into the back of the plane, threatened them with a bomb, which they did not have. That was a lie. Told them to sit still, shut up, don't do anything stupid. We're going back to the airport to have our demands met. Of course, another lie. But if you were on one of those 4 planes that morning, you would believe it, because that is exactly the way hijackings worked prior to 9/11. They hijack the plane, they go back to the airport. So the passengers and crew of Flight 93, within just a few minutes, have to come to terms with the fact that their plane dropped 700 feet in altitude, began flying erratically, threatened with a bomb, and told their plane's been hijacked and they're going back to the airport. So what do? They begin to make phone calls. Back then, they had those air phones on the back seats of planes. You could use a credit card, swipe a credit card to make a phone call. There were 37 attempted phone calls made from Flight 93. So the passengers and crew of Flight 93, they're not yet aware of what has happened in New York. It's probably around 9:35 or 9:40 or so. They're not yet aware of what has happened in New York. They're calling their loved ones just to tell their loved ones there's a problem, plane's been hijacked, we're going back to the airport. But by this time, 9:35 or 9:40, more than a half an hour after 9:03, more than a half an hour after we all knew that these were deliberate attacks. So a lot of us by that time, maybe most of us, were aware. We're watching the news. We're getting information. When the passengers and crew of Flight 93 call their loved ones to tell their loved ones there's a problem, the plane's been hijacked, their loved ones are saying, look, they are flying planes into buildings. You have to do something. You have to try to take the plane back. That's the difference with Flight 93. Because of the delays, the delay in Newark, the delay with the hijacking, they were able to get information from people on the ground, and then they had the opportunity to act. I think it's fair to say that if the passengers and crew of the other 3 planes had had the same information, same opportunity, they would have done something very, very similar to what the passengers on Flight 93 did. So again, try to imagine, within the space of less than 10 minutes, their plane drops 700 feet in altitude. Their plane starts flying erratically. They're threatened with a bomb. They're told their plane has been hijacked, and now they're making phone calls telling people they're going back to the airport, and they're finding out they are not going back to the airport. This is not a regular hijacking. This is a suicide mission hijacking. So just try to imagine coming to grips with all that within the space of less than 10 minutes. So I just want to stop and say right now, bravery is not the absence of fear. Bravery is not the absence of fear. Bravery is acting despite your fear. So what the passengers and crew of Flight 93 immediately started to do was make a plan to try to fight back, to try to regain control of that aircraft. We know that they were going to use the food service cart probably to try to bash open the cockpit door. One of the passengers on Flight 93 told his wife of their plan to fight back. Her question to him was, what do you have for weapons? And probably just half jokingly, he said, well, we have butter knives. But what did they have? We know they had the food service cart. We know they had butter knives. Flight attendant Sandy Waugh Bradshaw was boiling hot water to throw on the terrorists. And we know there was a corkscrew. The passengers and crew of Flight 93 were going to use anything and everything they had to try to fight back, to try to regain control of that airplane. But before they went into action, before they carried through, in my opinion, one of the most democratic things, that maybe the most democratic thing that happened on September 11th, 2001, happened on Flight 93. They took a vote. And we have no evidence that any of the passengers and crew of Flight 93 voted against fighting back. And if you've ever wondered who among the passengers and crew of Flight 93 took part in the fight to try to regain control of the plane, we have two phone calls that ended in very similar fashion that kind of tell us. Honor Elizabeth Wainio was speaking with her mother on the phone. She willingly gave up her phone call with her mother to say, I have to go. Everybody is running to the cockpit.
Oh.
And again, Sandy Waugh Bradshaw, the flight attendant who was boiling the hot water, talking with her husband on the phone, willingly gave up her phone call with her husband to say, I have to go. Everyone is running to first class. Everyone, everybody. One or both of them could have said, some of us, could have said a few of us. That is not what they said. They said everyone, everybody. So now, I don't want you to imagine a mob moving forward on this airplane, probably led by the food service cart. They were moving single file up a 20-inch wide aisle on a 757. Passenger revolt started at approximately 9:57 a.m. When the passenger revolt started, what were the passengers and crew of Flight 93 up against? 4 terrorists. One was the hijacker pilot. The other 3 were known as muscle men. These individuals were hardly large, imposing men. They were small men, and they were only armed with box cutters and knives. What were the terrorists up against? The terrorists were up against the likes of 6'4", 225-pound Mark Bingham, who is a 2-time national champion rugby player at the University of California. They were up against the likes of Linda Grondland, who was a lawyer, a race car driver, a skilled auto mechanic who knew karate. They were up against the likes of Japanese passenger Toshiya Kuge, who had been a linebacker on his American college football team. I didn't even know they had American college football in Japan, but he was a linebacker. And if you've not been up to the visitor center yet, look for his photograph in the visitor center. He's in his football uniform. And they were up against the likes of the youngest passenger on Flight 93, 20-year-old Leora Frances Bosley, who had been the captain of her high school basketball team. So there's a lot we don't know what happened on Flight 93. Let me wait till he clears out a little bit. It's easier on you. Yes, with the water. Yeah, so there's a lot we don't know. It happened on Flight 93. Like I said, the passenger revolt started at 9:57 a.m. What we do know is that once the hijacker pilot became aware that the passengers and crew of Flight 93 were coming to get him, first thing he did was he starts to wave the wings left and right, trying to keep them off balance and out of the cockpit. Next thing he does is what they call a series of porpoise maneuvers. Really steep climb, really steep dive, over and over again, trying to keep them out of the cockpit and off balance. Approximately 6 minutes after the passenger revolt started, at 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashed out here, marked by the boulder in the meadow out here. A came in at 563 miles an hour in a 40-degree dive and upside down the last few seconds of the flight. Partly because of the speed of the plane, partly because of the angle of the dive, and partly because all this ground up here has been dug up. For 10 years, from the mid-1960s to the mid-1990s, this was all a strip mine. So the ground up here is a little bit softer than normal undisturbed earth. Not that you could tell by walking on it, but it is a little bit softer. So when Flight 93 came in at that speed, at that angle, hit that soft ground, it just completely embedded into the ground. There were still 5,500 gallons of jet fuel on board. That exploded. When they did the investigation up here, they had to dig down 40 feet out here before they stopped finding parts of the plane. That's how far into the ground Flight 93 went. But the investigation here was very important, not just for Flight 93, but for 9/11 in general. Here they recovered both black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. Also, there was a Pennsylvania state trooper walking along the tree line out there. He looks down, he sees a credit card. Turns out that credit card belonged to one of the terrorists. So the FBI was able to use that to follow the money.
Cool.
And again, if you've not been up to the visitor center yet, we have a photograph of the credit card on display up in the visitor center. So with a normal hijacking, the hijackers don't care if the plane is identified by the flight controllers or tracked. They don't care. On the morning of September 11th, the terrorists did care if they were being tracked and identified. So they turned off the transponders, which made them difficult, if not impossible, to either track or identify. When Flight 93 crashed out here, it wasn't like the whole world knew about it. In fact, it wasn't until later that morning that the connection was made. Well, first of all, that a plane had crashed, and then the connection was made that this was connected with the other events of September 11th. And as a matter of fact, at 10:14 a.m., 11 minutes after Flight 93 crashed, the FAA first notified the military that Flight 93 was a hijack. At that point, 10:14, FAA still did not know that Flight 93 had crashed. And at 10:14 was the first time the military even heard about a plane, Flight 93. We are about 17 minutes flight time from Washington, D.C., where we're at right now. Flight 93 would have reached the city at around 10:20 or so. It was later determined that Washington, D.C. was unprotected at that time, not protected until later that morning. It's almost a certainty that Flight 93 would have reached its target. We don't know for 100% certainty that the Capitol was the target for Flight 93, but we believe it was for some really strong reasons. One is just that the Capitol is a large building, sits up on a hill, so a fairly easy physical target. Two is that September 11th, 2001 was not some random date chosen by the terrorists, and it was not chosen because of the 911 emergency call number. September 11th, 2001 was chosen because the House and Senate were both back in session that morning. We believe they were the targets for Flight 93. And then, for what it's worth, we have testimony from captured terrorists who say it was the Capitol. And then aviation people, after they looked into the low level of training that these hijacker pilots had, they were not trained to take off. They did not know how to take off. They were not trained to land. They did not know how to land. And really, they barely knew how to fly these planes. So aviation people say that a pilot with that low level of training, flying at low altitude, high speed into Washington, D.C., would have been nearly impossible to target the White House. So that's why we believe the Capitol was the target for Flight 93. For those of you old enough, and I to remember 9/11. I see a couple of you. Think back to the day of September 11th and the days that followed, and how almost all of us spent so much time in front of our televisions watching the destruction that had happened in New York, the terrible loss of life that had happened there, the destruction that had happened in Washington, D.C., terrible loss of life that happened there. I think we can all agree those were just awful, awful, awful days. Had it not been for what the passengers and crew of Flight 93 did by acting bravely, quickly, decisively, the other thing we would have been watching in those days would have been our U.S. Capitol building in ruins and on fire. We would have been hearing about the loss of life of much of our government leadership. We would have been hearing about the loss of life of even more of our military leadership. That's kind of why I say the whole world really owes them a great deal of gratitude, because without them doing what they did, it's possible that our response to the September 11th, 2001 attacks may have been slower, may have been different. So that's why I say we all really owe them a great deal of our respect, our gratitude, our thanks. And I'll just close this by saying, and then I'll take any questions you might have. Recently, us volunteer ambassadors and rangers and other employees of Flight 93 really had the distinct honor to be invited to tour the Pentagon last month. The Pentagon last month. And while we were there, we had a survivor from the 9/11 Pentagon attack speak with us. And what he said was that in the days following 9/11, when they started to return to work, they couldn't know who among their colleagues and friends had survived and who had not survived. So it became a tradition that I believe still exists to this day, that whenever they would see anybody, they would say, "It's good to see you." And the other person would say back, "It's good to see you too." Simple but powerful. So I'll just wrap this up by saying, again, thank you for coming. If you have any questions, I'll take any questions you might have, and I'll just conclude by saying it's good to see you all.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Yeah, question.
Do we know what the status of the pilot, co-pilot?
The only information we have about the pilot and co-pilot after the hijacking at 9:28 comes at 9:45. One of the terrorists says, "Bring the pilot back." We don't know what. There's no further reference to either pilot. We don't know why he said it. We don't know if the pilot, co-pilot were alive at that point or not. We just don't know. But I will say that if Captain Jason Dahl was the pilot, and Leroy Homer was the first officer, if those terrorists thought that they were going to get some help, that wasn't going to happen. Yeah.
This is probably a good advanced question. Forgive me for asking this. Why was it that 3 of the airplanes that were chosen were United flights? You'd think like early morning flights, there'd probably be a distribution of different airliners that they would have taken.
Yeah, I don't. Well, no, there weren't. There were 2 United and 2 American.
Oh, 2 of each?
It was American 11. Wait a minute. American 11, American 77, United 175, United 93.
They were the 2 largest carriers at the time.
Yeah.
So it ended up just being probably statistically these were the flights that met their criteria, regardless of what their carrier was.
Doesn't sound like it.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
That was great, Paul.
Thank you.
Yeah. That was great.
Thank you all for your attention.
John. And Leroy Homer.
No.
If you want to, I've read the job.
Well, again, we don't know. I don't want to speculate. We don't know for sure. Most likely, you think about the pilot and co-pilot, they're strapped in, and they can be easily attacked. They can be easily attacked from behind.
Especially with box cutters.
Very well have been injured.
And again, this is something we don't know for sure. We believe on all four flights.
Miles, you got?
They were seated behind passenger, and probably what they did very first is stab that passenger to create fear. Yep. And also, we don't know how they got into the cockpit on any of the four flights. Yeah, they took basically practice flights throughout the summer. We think that probably what they were doing is they were watching what
How everything works.
the flight attendant, when the flight attendants opened that door.
Yeah, because it's usually routine for food into the pilots as well.
Yeah, so we don't know with Flight 93 if maybe the flight attendants didn't go in right away, or maybe the hijacker pilot got cold feet. That's also a possibility. But again, that's all speculation.
Yeah, because we don't know.
A friend of ours actually, the Pentagon, his first friend of ours, his office
Near where?
and everyone in his area of the ring had, because they had been notified they were looking to do the response, so they had all been pulled to the other side or the death side. That would have been significant.
And the other thing too is, a few years ago they took us on another trip to the Pentagon, and we had we call ourselves ambassadors here, but they're called docents down there. We had a docent, and the docents down there have to have some kind of connection either with the Pentagon or with American Airlines. The story he told us was they had planned to reinforce the Pentagon with steel reinforcement, blast-proof windows, since it's a 5-sided building, move everybody out, do the work, move everybody back in, go to the next section. The only section that they had finished was the section that the plane hit. And luckily they had not moved everybody back in yet, or else the death toll would have been higher. But then the kicker to that story was he said if it wouldn't have been for that steel reinforcement, the plane would have went through further. And he said I would not be here to tell you the story. He said because I was in that. He said he got out with some smoke inhalation and some burns, but he survived.
Yeah, he was at our Optimist convention this weekend. And,
That's one of the reasons.
We talk about it again, it's like,
Oh, yeah.
So where are you guys all from?
We're from Windsor, Ontario.
Windsor? Oh, you're Canucks.
Where we brought them.
where is the actual, is it right here?
Yeah,
there's a,
yeah, if you walk out there, you'll be able to see the.
The way it impacts the way
I got to tell you a good Canadian story.
Besides Newfoundland, with planes.
That's a good one too. I'll tell you a good Canadian story. It doesn't have, it's personal. It doesn't have anything to do with 9/11. I took my grandson to see a baseball game in Pittsburgh, and they were playing Toronto, and all of the restaurants around the stadium were packed. And I had promised my grandson to grab something to eat before we go in. So there was this one place that was actually connected with the stadium that had tacos, and I signed up to wait. This couple from Canada who were from Toronto, who was in line before us, the woman said, when they get called in, if we're at a table for 4, you come on in.
we do that all the time.
And they did. Saved me, I know, at least 20 minutes, half an hour.
And with the little one,
And we had a really nice conversation with them, and yeah. it was
Who
really
won the
good.
game?
Toronto.
All right.
that sounds like when we were in Baltimore the one time. They
Almost
said,
had my
welcome,
days
you're
too
welcome
short."
here, but don't come back.
We're more than happy to have you here. We
Nothing after 4.
got the tour of the whole, everything. More than happy to have you here. Don't come back.
Yeah, but when people, he's a very strong military. He was just talking to me, they had moved over to the other side.
You know, so, yep.
Now that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
22
we're
years
Optimus
ago,
International.
it's still
We're
going strong.
we're now in.
Kind of fate, yeah.
How many
You just
flights?
never know. Like one of the passengers on Flight 93 aboard the Tucson here in Colas, pregnant with their first child.
We are
Her husband, and she flew a lot for work. Her husband said that she never got to the airport early. Never. Always running late. That morning, for some reason, she got to the airport early. And she was actually scheduled on a different United, a later United, later United flight. And you know, back then, if you got to the airport early, you could jump, you could request it. That's what she did. She wasn't even supposed to be on the flight.
Well, yeah, and we have a friend who was
We are 105 years
an
old.
attendant at the time, a flight attendant.
Actually, next year our
She was on her way. Her husband owns most of the ambulance service in Florida.
They crossed the border.
Very well to
Built
do.
in Toronto,
She loved
Hamilton,
doing it, so Tony just decided. She ended up in Newfoundland. Our daughter lived in she landed in Newfoundland, and to this day we just saw them this weekend again.
We love
I mean,
going.
there's
Far from
nothing.
us, but we
Right,
love
yeah,
being
yeah,
there.
exactly.
More than be
I
with
lived
the
there too.
Canadians when they get with us.
Nice
I
place to
couldn't
visit,
wait to
but I
get
don't
out.
want
I
to.
like going there to
How
visit,
they
but
sat
to
on the
live there,
tarmac for
Think
something
pretty
like
sure.
12 hours.
Sure.
Tom got
every
her stuff
single
together.
day.
and
More than I
got-
could.
got
Our daughter-in-law.
That's what
Things
when he said that
available.
back there,
People
right?
opened
You
their
know,
doors.
Rain on Optimus.
To this day,
She
she
could look.
sees
think
us
actually-
just
She
like
could
yeah.
look
how
across
close.
from where
Right.
she lived.
But
They're
these
still
two
going
benches,
on.
my
Across at
wife,
Manhattan
our two
or
friends
Said
from
they
Windsor,
were
and then two friends from
on a flight.
Omaha.
Just
somewhere up
somewhere.
there.
I call it not a convention, it's a family reunion.
But we're 40 miles
And
from
couldn't talk to
You
her
know,
husband.
because
Where was the convention?
So
in Arlington,
shut
and they had the bus tours, and we had, when our
There's not a lot
convention
of
was in
countries
Baltimore,
or
we
whether
took
you're
the train
from
in
Oklahoma.
So they were in,
that year.
where they were
And
in
we took the
Newfoundland,
double-deck
not a
bus
big
tour
place at all.
Caused a lot of
Right.
see everything, you know.
Gan-
and-
Gander, right?
Which was
Yeah,
neat,
Gander.
past all the
Well,
embassies,
nothing
the
is
White
bigger than
House.
Newfoundland.
Couldn't get
Except
that close to the
except for
White
the
House.
roads and the distance
The problems
between
that
everything.
are when they are,
You know,
no
there's
matter,
a play now
That's
called
right.
Come From Away.
you know,
And the
It's
Renaissance
musical.
Center.
Yeah, yeah.
whatever
Story, and
stripe
if you ever
you,
get the chance
we
to
always
see it
joke.
come,
We
because I know
never-
it's now coming
did-
through the state.
and no one knew.
We've seen it
Because no
several
one
times.
knew where it
I've
I
heard
went to
about it.
Toronto,
Was.
it is
Probably
amazing.
already
It truly is the story.
kick it to the
And,
curb and,
if it ever comes
I know,
to
it's,
our
it's so
eyes,
hard with a
something,
dual,
it would be something if you get
you know,
together with your
yes, there
friends
is the
and
other
see that, because
fringe
it's
thing,
got the
but
humor
the
in it
chances
of
of them,
things that happen, but it
but-
really is heartwarming how they opened their doors.
okay,
It's
yeah.
called Come From Away.
Yeah, I know it.
And, yeah, and it's not,
No,
like
no,
right now,
no,
they're still
official,
doing it on Broadway and, you know, places around North America.
Yeah, I bet.
Well, just before the pandemic hit, we had a volunteer from one of our ambassadors went to Gander and met with the mayor up there. And, yeah,
Right on, it's in the US.
Going
This
independent.
is our last
Right,
stop was
exactly.
Gettysburg yesterday. And you know, a lot of people don't know this meeting. One of our.
Yeah, that's enough, and it's that way,
Okay.
you know,
And
of course,
even
we
the
have some of the,
young kids
both the
had
left and the
first
right that
American
have
history in
infiltrated
high school.
Canada.
You know, and yes,
With their
there's
thing,
only
they
sent them
semesters,
up there.
one semester, the history.
Well,
I didn't know.
all
They'll
dedicated
take
to American history. My kids probably know more about American history than some.
I always tell my son and daughter, every time I go to Flight
Some of
93
the, you know,
volunteer,
the,
I learn
the
something
fringe
new.
on both.
Yes, yes, our
Mainly
education
one way, but that's
system
besides the point.
absolutely has been
At one time,
So I had a
voted
set
for
of nine,
three different parties in Canada.
14-year-old.
On what I liked, you know, and like you said, independent. Yeah, because, nope, I don't, even though my sister won't talk to
But
me
they all
because I
knew
know
what
the
it was.
same way she
It's
does.
not like they were following their parents. They
You know,
I would not have been able to.
yeah.
and
It's like I, yeah, I can't.
Started, called the
Yeah, we're kind of sisters and brothers, really.
absolutely, we're in the same bed. If anything happens,
Exactly.
the only thing separating us is like, you know,
Quarter-mile of water.
Yeah, that's it.
we have our convention next year for the Optimist Club in Niagara Falls. So all the Americans are going to come over the border. It's
Yep.
not going to be, I mean, it's the falls. You got the rotten falls, we got the good falls.
You know what? I was in Toronto back in, well, this is like 1999. And we went up there to see a show.
What's your name? Dwight.
Oh, what's the Phantom of the Opera? I was really impressed with how clean Toronto. But I had somebody
Normally I have
recently.
business cards, but I left everything.
Oh yeah,
So that's where I can go.
that'll be nice.
No, and the Americans, like, normally our conventions always says over the 1st of July, which is Canada Day, and the 4th of July. This year we moved it into June, and so they're all like so excited, because they can still do their, you know, their flag, their pretty flags out, their flags around their cities across North
What's the
America.
bag we
So they're all now.
And they're
we
looking
come
like, what are you
back and
talking
forth.
about?
We come
So
back
they
to
do
family
this. There is
barbecues,
no
or
restriction.
fundraisers,
We
they do,
get
or
there.
whatever it is, and still
There's
get
bag
their
restrictions.
a week
Yeah,
with us.
people are coming in with backpacks, you'll have to leave it or take it back to your car.
Anyway, this was wonderful.
Yeah, it was nice talking to you.
Yeah, and to hear the individual stories, you know, it's a personal touch.
Yeah, I wish we'd like to highlight all 40, but that's just not
Yeah,
possible.
no.
That's just not possible. But I try to hit, I don't want to say important ones, but you know,
No,
ones
no,
that
the
kind
ones that have something that shares the tragedy as it unfolds.
And I always loved this picture of Lorraine Bay. I just think she looks like such a fun person.
Yeah, oh yeah, she's got a twinkle in her eye.
She does.
And you haven't done it again.
Well, safe trip.
Safe trip back for you.
Thursday, we went to a hockey game at Joe